Hey, deserving listeners, I'm going to answer some upper tier patron emails. Some of these questions are really great. This first email is from upper tier patron Annette from Latvia, and she says, oh, by the way, just chiming in here, she has a lot of nice things to say up front, and normally I wouldn't read this part of the email. I always appreciate it, by the way, but I don't usually read it because it just feels like it's not relevant to the listeners and would feel like I'd just be bragging, but it actually does pertain to this email to have this included. So she writes, I have been listening to your podcast for about 2 years now, and I have learned so many good things from you. It has helped me with my present relationship with my husband. I noticed that I really like you as a person. I regard your opinion very highly, and it somehow makes me feel better knowing that you exist in the world. And then in your comments reaction videos where you described all the criticism about the Johnny Depp and Amber Heard trial stuff, you mentioned that some of the people might have such a harsh reaction to you because of transference. This made me think and realize that what I might be experiencing might also be transference to you, but in a positive way. This feels good, but it also makes me a little worried too to have transference. Is it normal that I have transference for you? Can it be harmful to me? Or maybe this is the reason why all of your content has given me so much good and that I am having a corrective experience and transference is a natural part of that. I am guessing other listeners might be experiencing transference for you too. What are your thoughts and feelings about it? End of email. Yeah, that's a good question, Annette. Other people have told me that they have transference or something. I don't know if they would necessarily use that term, but that they are having a corrective experience through the podcast, whether it's me or Bob or someone else. And yeah, it's totally normal. I ran into this a lot at first as a professor and a supervisor, because as a client, as a therapist, when I would work with clients, they would have transference with me. And early in my career, since I started to specialize in personality disorders early in my career, I started to learn a lot of the theory on transference and transference-based therapies and how it's not only just a natural product of that kind of work with clients, but also you want to use it to benefit the client by helping them to internalize a different experience with someone that is like a parent figure to them. A parent figure that is non-exploitative, that is attachment secure, that is safe and caring and loving and attuned. By experiencing that, you can effectively correct, as the phrase goes, corrective experience. You can correct for the traumas, you can heal the traumas from the past, and thus the personality changes and the defenses no longer are needed, and the individual can move forward in the future with other relationships in positive, healthy ways, non-reactive, non-distorted ways, right? So I ran into that with a lot of clients, of course, and then I started to experience it with students and with supervisees, particularly, particular students and particular supervisees who I bonded a lot with. And it's important to recognize as a supervisor, and I suppose as a professor as well, that attachment and attunement are important elements when trying to shepherd a novice therapist into the field. There's a lot of emotion ups and downs. So when you're a student, when you're a trainee, and you need to have mentors and people in authority and people who can mentor you, who can make you feel safe, who can teach you, who can give you the space to make mistakes, give you the space to learn and explore, and all the things that parents give children, mentors want to give to their trainees. And attachment and thus transference will occur. And so the students, supervisees would sometimes tell me, by the way, you are a corrective experience for me because I had an abusive father, for example, and when I first started to look to you as a mentor, it was really scary, and I was hoping I could trust you, and you've proven yourself to me that you can be trusted, and I have internalized that, and it has reworked my view not only of fathers, but of men in general, and that has been very beneficial to me. And I that's great. I don't necessarily set out to do that explicitly, but I do set out to create a safe, secure, attuned place of authority, of helping these individuals. And so transference is natural. I had those transferences as well as a client and as a student, as a mentee myself. Mentors were father figures to me, absolutely. I saw them as such. I didn't go through a lot of relational traumas growing up, so I didn't necessarily need a tremendous amount of corrective experiences, but transference was there for me as well. So for podcast listeners to experience that transference, it's totally normal. It's expected to happen. It is understood, and it's not scary. You ask, could it be harmful to you? Yeah, it could, there's a chance, right? Because I'm not there to actually interact with you. If you were a student, a supervisee, or a client, we could monitor the transference and look out for distortions or other issues that can arise. I think the common fears that society will have, which is unfounded, is somehow you're going to become too attached to me and too dependent on me, and you will become obsessed with me, and you'll want to stalk me or something. And that's just, I don't know where that comes from. Maybe there was a set of movies or books that came out about that kind of thing, fans who become over obsessed with some public figure. But 99.99% of people who have transference to a public figure, that's not going to happen because, Annette, I'm just going to take a guess and say that you're not capable of that sort of thing. The idea is that through our corrective experiences, through our transferences, which we're having all the time, hopefully it enriches us. It makes us feel safer. It helps us. It gives us a model to follow. And it's beneficial to the point where, so I'll just speak for myself, the transferences that I had, when I needed them most, they were there. And what it did is it gave me, and I leaned into that transference, right? And the father figure leaned into me, and we developed a very deep relationship, deeper than the typical, say, supervisor, supervisee, or professor-student relationship. And through that deepening and that enriching and that learning and that safety and that exploration, for me, I was able to absorb that and internalize it such that eventually I didn't need them around anymore, right? So the idea is that you transfer onto me and others, your therapist and maybe a professor or two or something, and it is absorbed over time, and then eventually you don't necessarily need that transference anymore. You still hold on to elements of it, threads of it, but you're not dependent on it as much as you were in the past, perhaps, If people transfer onto me for the rest of their lives, again, there's nothing really at risk, huge at risk. The thing you just want to monitor is just, do you have other people in your life? Is the relationship that, the parasocial relationship that we have, is it overall beneficial to you? Does it, you just want a case-by-case basis, but it does, I'm not particularly scared by that kind of thing. All right, this next question is from upper tier patron Alyssa from Los Angeles. She says, what do you think was the best band to come out of Seattle? And it doesn't have to be a grunge band. End of email. It's a great question. I love short little questions like this. I did a full survey of all the Seattle bands off the top of my head, and my number one Seattle band is the Posies. Some of you probably know of them, and most of you probably don't. But their two albums that I love are Dear 23 and Frosting on the Beater. These two albums were just huge for me. There was a lot of grunge, a lot of heavy metal going on in the 80s in Seattle. And before grunge, there was mainly just heavy metal. Like if you listen to early Soundgarden stuff, it's really heavy. And it's kind of fun to listen to now, but it's not really the first thing that I go to. Soundgarden later albums are masterpieces. The last few albums are just masterpieces. But I was never into the super heavy stuff. I liked The Cure and Depeche Mode and that kind of stuff. And so the Posies were a band that were definitely in that vein. And I just always loved the Posies. And the two singers, they harmonize, they both write songs, John Auer and Singleton, I think his name is. Anyway, so the Posies. Honorable mention, Soundgarden. The last few albums are fantastic. Death Cab for Cutie, Sunny Day Real Estate, Flop, actually a pretty unknown Seattle band called Flop, was one of my favorites. You can actually go on YouTube and look up The Great Valediction, great song. They were extremely punk in their attitude and very drunk a lot of the time. They actually were famous for being drunk at their shows, which wasn't great, but it was kind of the times. And a lot of these bands I played side by side with, like bands like Flop, Soundgarden, Death Cab, 70 Real Estate. These bands were playing in Seattle at the same time I was in my band. And sometimes, anyway, point is those are great bands. Band of Horses, Band of Horses is considered a Seattle band. I don't know if they think of themselves as a Seattle band, but I love Band of Horses. There's so many great songs. Foo Fighters, of course, the first 2 albums, though. After that, I don't really know much of the music. I was obsessed with those first 2 albums in the early, mid-90s. Of course, you have Heart with Ann and Nancy Wilson. I've been listening to more Heart lately on vinyl, and they have some great songs. I mean, there's probably like 10, 15 songs that are just like great songs. What's that, Dog and the Butterfly? Barracuda. Of course, other bands from Seattle that are worth mentioning. Of course, you got Nirvana, Tad, Ray Charles, Bing Crosby. Bing Crosby's from Tacoma. Screaming Trees, also not necessarily... Some of these bands aren't necessarily from proper Seattle. I mean, Nirvana isn't actually technically from Seattle. They're from Aberdeen, and you could argue Olympia, but they're considered to be Seattle. Screaming Cheese, Sad Happy, Sir Mix-a-Lot, Alice in Chains, Hammerbox, Kenny Loggins from Everett, Pearl Jam, Macklemore, Dave Matthews, Mudhoney, Melvins, Harvey Danger, who opened for us actually back in the day. We felt bad for them because no one was at their show. They actually played at a house party in my bedroom. Fleet Foxes, great band, beautiful, beautiful music. They were neighbors actually next to us in our practice space. Green River, Mother Love Bone, Postal Service, Taco Cat, great band, Taco Cat. Kenny G, of course, good old Kenny G. Temple of the Dog, Fastbacks, Thunder Pussy, Head in the Heart, Candlebox, Modest Mouse, Brandy Carlisle, Presidents of the United States, the Black Tones, friends of mine, Blue Scholars, Queensryche, The Ventures, and the list goes on and on. I'm guessing for most of you, you don't know any of these bands. All right, let's take a break, and when we get back, more questions. All right, we're back from the break. So listener Adam from Montreal sent in an email with a bunch of questions, a bunch of personal questions about me and my career. And I thought that maybe everyone might be interested in hearing the answers to these questions. The first question here is, when and why did you choose to study psychology and become a therapist? Well, I've answered this question many times, so I won't bore everyone with my usual answers. So I'm going to try to maybe provide a different answer than I usually say. And what I'll say is that I wanted to do something to help other people that didn't involve being in front of crowds. I wanted to help individuals. Like one of the jobs that popped into my head just before a therapist popped into my head was to be a music teacher. I wanted to mentor children and teenagers with music, and that popped into my head. But then I thought, I don't want to corral kids. There's crowds involved when you're teaching music. I don't know why just individualized instruction didn't pop into my head, and then when therapy popped in my head, it just all fit. I don't know how to describe it, actually. I'd never thought of it before. I was 24 when it popped into my head. I was in traffic, and I was just sitting there bored, and it pops in my head, and everything clicked. It involved so many different things that I already knew about myself that I liked. I liked exploring things. I liked getting deep with people. I liked thinking about my own psychology. I liked helping people. I liked trying to problem solve. I liked thinking about relationships and early childhood development. And I had the suspicion, and it's true, that to be a therapist meant you would always have to be learning, and you would never really master it, right? Like a lot of jobs that popped in my head, I thought, well, after a few years, I'll probably master that as well. The learning curve will start to plateau off a little bit, and I'll just get bored of it. I already knew that about myself, that I got bored of things that weren't challenging to me. And incidentally, I figured at best I would be a therapist for 10 years. I just couldn't imagine being at one job for more than 10 years. I just thought there's just no way that one job is going to hold my attention. In fact, I probably thought, well, this will probably only last like 5 to 7 years before I switch careers to something else, and because I'll just get bored of therapy. And boy, was I wrong. That was 20. So as 95 when I applied to graduate school. Yeah, so it's almost 30 years. My God. So yeah. All right, the next question is, what are the positives and negatives of being a therapist? So just a short list of pros of being a therapist, pros and cons. The pros that I can think of off the top of my head are that you get to help others. It depends on what we mean by therapist, but if we're just talking about your general psychotherapist who helps people in therapy, then yeah, helping others is incredibly gratifying, to be ground level. I mean, just think about all the therapists out there who have 20, 30, 40 clients a week, and every one of those clients, or let's say 80% of those clients, every session is valuable to them, is helpful to them. When I first became a therapist, I just marveled at the drama and the magic that was happening in every session throughout the day. I would have, say, 7 sessions in one day, and at the end of the day, I'd look back and I just think like, no one has any idea the magic that is happening in each of these sessions, and how many moments of magic are happening. Sessions can be long and winding roads. Just a 50-minute session can be just a multifaceted adventure with people, and it's wonderful. It's a wonderful feeling. It obviously is improving the world in a lot of ways, and so that's a big pro. Also, being a therapist is interesting. Like I was saying earlier, I thought I'd get bored of being a therapist after 10 years, and no. There's so much to explore and learn. Also, you can make good money in private practice if you work it right. Not like mansion level money, but, good enough money so that you could get a nice house and a nice car and go on vacations now and then. Not everyone, of course, but if you work it right and you're in the right market, you have the right mentors. You can have a flexible schedule. This is a big reason why I wanted to be a therapist, was because at the time when I was stuck in traffic, when I was 24, I had an office job. I had my own office. I wore a business suit to work, and I was a project manager at a market research firm, and I could see my whole life sort of before me, but the shift was from 8 to 5 with an hour break in the middle, right? And I had to wake up because of traffic. I had to get up, I think at like 6:30 or 6 or something. I know some of y'all get up. I think my wife gets up at 5:30 in the morning. I get up at 9 currently because I am such a night owl, and by opposition, I am not a morning person. I've tried to shift my sleeping. I go to bed at like 2 and wake up at 9. And everyone in my family's like this. My brother, my sister, my parents, night owls. And so I was like, I cannot work 8 to 5. It's torture. So having a flexible schedule, not only if you're a night owl, is helpful, but also if you have kids and the special needs kids, or you have a medical issue that requires you to kind of dial in your schedule really well, having a flexible schedule, can really help. And again, I'm talking about private practice. If you're working in an agency, it's completely different. Obviously, if working in an agency, it isn't 8 to 5, that kind of stuff. Anyway, another pro being a therapist is you can have deep conversations. You can actually have like real deep, meaningful conversations with people, not only with your clients, of course, but even with colleagues, because we're used to it, right? You can involve yourself in a lot of self-work. You're expected as a part of your job to go to therapy and to explore yourself and to heal and to take care of yourself. You have the opportunity to improve your relationships. I can't imagine where my relationship with my wife would be if I wasn't a therapist. I mean, I would like to think that I would have figured out some of this stuff, but I don't know. I mean, God knows who I would have been. With the trajectory I was going on in my early 20s, I was just going to be a regular market research person in tech, and I probably wouldn't have studied attachment or any of that stuff. And so I'm just going to take a guess and say that my relationships would have been a lot worse. There's so much that you learn as a therapist about relationships and attachment and personality. And you, of course, start applying it to yourself and you're like, huh. Another benefit to being a therapist is you can have a lot of diversification in your jobs. Like you can be a therapist, you can work in research under doctorate level people, you can be a podcaster, you can be a trainer, you could be a consultant, you can work with different kinds of clients. There's just a lot of things teaching you can do with the credential. The cons are that it can be very stressful, not only being a therapist, but also graduate school and being supervised. There's a lot of money and time you have to spend on graduate school, a lot of money, a lot of time, a lot of blood, sweat, and tears. And there are abusive people in my field. There are abusive professors, there are abusive supervisors. They're in complete power over you. And if they're abusive, then they're going to ruin your life. That's happened to me. You also, a big con to entering the field is you won't know if you're going to like it until you're there. And this would happen. People would say, oh, I want to be a therapist. And then they'd enter graduate school and then they would go to internship. And sometimes it takes a couple years, 2-3 years before you're even at internship. This is the very first time you're actually doing the work, right? You're not just reading books and writing papers. And it's then when you actually start to feel it out, because you can't sit in the therapist seat until you have that education, right? So you'll never know what it's like. There are other jobs where you can kind of feel what it's like. Like if you wanted to, be a manager at a restaurant or something, you could probably imagine what it's like, or have smaller jobs where you're managing fewer people. I don't know. There's approximations. Whereas therapists, it's really a unique experience. And for some people, they think they want to be a therapist, but then when they actually are given the job and they experience it in first person, they realize that they don't like it. So there's a bit of a risk there. It doesn't happen very often, but it is a bit of a risk. The thing that I would recommend if you, one of the listeners, are in that camp where you're like, maybe I'm going to be one of those people, is to think about why it is that you want to be a therapist. Because when I hear people say things like, I want to be a therapist because I want to write a book, or I want to be a therapist because I want to travel the world, or something like that, I'm like, that's risky. What I hear from people that I have a lot of confidence that this won't happen to them, that they won't change their mind, they'll say things like, I was a client and I had 3 different therapists, but there was this one therapist that really, really helped me, and I want to do what she does. What she was doing for me, I want to do for other people. When I hear stuff like that, I'm like, okay, you're straight as an arrow into the therapist seat, right? You're not doing the career or the degree for some kind of ancillary reason. Anyway, the other con here that I jotted down is that it can become wearisome, actually. So this happened to me, and I've heard other therapists, this will happen to them as well. And this is where the diversification in the job comes around, is that when I started out as a therapist, all I wanted to do was get to a place where I was in private practice. I was doing a lot of other gigs. I was working for agencies. I was doing a lot of in-home therapy. And what I was trying to achieve was where I was in private practice and people were coming to my office and I wasn't commuting and I was charging my, regular price and I had a full load, and it was hard to get there quickly. But eventually when I got there, I was like, oh, I finally arrived. I've arrived at the Holy Land, and now it's just, smooth sailing, and then I'll retire one day and this will be my career. And after a while, where I would have, and I only had, I think 27 sessions a week kind of a thing. And I worked Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and half Thursday, by the way. And you'd think that'd be a pretty sweet job, right? Every week I have a 3-day weekend, a 3.5-day weekend. And after working, I had energy. I wasn't burnt out after. I could hang out with friends after work, that kind of thing, or to work on other projects. But I couldn't figure it out. What is it? Why was I kind of dreading going to work sometimes? And this would have been 2006 or something. And what I figured out was every client I love, and every client I look forward to seeing. But when I think about all 27 clients at once, it just feels overwhelming to me. It feels like kind of a slog in a way, even though no individual client felt like, there were a couple clients back then that I can remember that were not so great. Like there was this 7-year-old kid who was a wonderful little girl, but she wasn't interactive in therapy at all. And it made the session go by extremely begrudgingly, if you will. So, there were a few, it wasn't horrible, but it wasn't an hour that I really was super looking forward to in my week. But overall, everything was fine, but it just felt like this overwhelming weight that Sunday night, as I'm, thinking about the week, I'm just like, I can't wait till Thursday afternoon when all this is over, And again, at the same time, I loved my clients. When I saw them and they walked in my office, I enjoyed them. I wasn't bored with them. It was interesting and dynamic work. And so it was this weird juxtaposition of those two things. And what saved me actually was that, so I was teaching at Antioch as an adjunct, which was, 1 or 2 classes a quarter. And it was, so what I would do is I would teach on that Friday that I wasn't working, kind of a thing. But eventually the teaching gig, which was really just this secondary thing, and it wasn't a huge money maker. My main money maker was my practice, and the teaching was just kind of like a hobby in a sense, because they don't pay professors very much. I loved teaching. I loved the students, but every once in a while there'd be this student that would just be a huge thorn in my side. I mean, if you've never experienced this as a professor, then you don't know. But when you're a student in a class, you're probably one of the good students, right? You're probably one of the nice ones. And you might look around the room and see the other students, and you might go like, oh, that other student, you might look across the room and see one student that you don't like very much. You'd be like, I don't like that student. Well, the thing is, if they're a classmate of yours, it's pretty easy to avoid a classmate. If you're a professor, you can't avoid a student. You have to have contact with all the students, right? You interact quite intensely with every student. And so you would, as a professor, just be forced to deal with these people. And I found that 90% of the emotional outlay that I had as a professor was for like 3% of the students. There'd be one student that would just occupy all of my energy and time and sleepless nights. And so I quit being a professor because of that. And there were other reasons too, but that was kind of the main reason. It was just like, I can't take that 1 in 50 student kind of person that just, I could talk about, you could imagine what sort of people these are. Sometimes we'd have to kick them out of the program because of their behavior, and some of them were abusive to me. It happens, right? Of course, you don't want to let those people into your program, but sometimes they trick you. Anyway, so my mentor, Paul, sucked me back in as a professor adjunct, and then I was a teacher for another 5 years or something. And then again, I just couldn't take it, so I quit again. So in the late aughts was during this time when I was having a lot of wearisome feelings because I was just a private practice therapist. Well, what saved me is Paul calls me out of the blue in 2009. And, well, let me back up. So this is when I started the podcast in 2008, partly out of a way to try to break up my week, right? I was trying to diversify. I was also kind of missing teaching, and so I started to do the podcast because I missed teaching, but also I wanted to have something else to do professionally other than being a therapist all week, because it just felt like it felt. And then a year after that, so in 2008, I start the podcast. 2009, Paul David calls me out of the blue and says, would you like a full-time job at Antioch? And I was like, at first I was like, no, I don't like teaching. But then I thought, I've never been full-time. I've always just been adjunct. And I was initially like, no. There's no. I'm done with I'm retired. I tried it once, I quit, and then I got sucked back in. I tried it for a while, and it was overall a negative in my life. There were a lot of good things, but there were a lot of bad things. And he sucked me back in, and overnight, I went from a no to a yes, and then I said yes. And I thought, well, worst case scenario, I try it for a year and I quit. I can always quit. I'm not under some grand contract. So maybe full-time will be different. And it was very different. Being full-time was very different. I had collegial support. When you're an adjunct, you're a gun for hire. you park 5 minutes, you drive up to the university 5 minutes before your class starts. You walk into class, you teach your class, and you go straight to your car and you drive home. I mean, that's an exaggeration to some extent, but you're not an integral part of the university. You don't have a bunch of colleagues that you just are naturally interacting with all day, whereas full-time I was. And so that support and that collegiality and that energy and that dynamic back and forth between all the professors was great, and it offset those negatives that I experienced. And so I actually quit the podcast. I don't know if y'all know this, but I stopped the podcast because I was like, I have a full-time practice. I'm going to be a full-time professor. And soon I'm going back to school to get my doctorate. I don't have time to do this podcast, particularly because the podcast is, no one's watching it, no one's listening to it, and it's taking up a lot of time. Everyone's asking me, why do you make this thing to begin with? And so I actually stopped the podcast and always thought maybe I'd start it up again, but wasn't sure about it. And then I did about a year later. I picked it up again slowly. And then anyway, point is then I started to scale back on my practice quite a bit. And then I got into this perfect zone where I was teaching full time. I was also an administrator and an advisor in this, because being a professor, it's like 10 or 20% teaching and 80% administration. But it was fun, get to work with other people. And then I had my small private practice, which was, I don't know, maybe 10 clients a week. And I supervised people, and I just had this, and then I podcasted, and I had this perfect mix every week. And every day it was interesting. And now I'm just a podcaster. I'm not actually teaching currently. I plan on teaching once I get more time. And I have a very small private practice. So I don't have much of that balance anymore in the same way, but I do have a balance because the podcast itself is actually multifaceted. There's a lot of different things that I do. I do stuff like this. I do stuff like deep dives. I do stuff like videos and blah, blah, blah. So all this is to say that when people are in private practice for the long haul, and that's all they do, it can become a lot. Now, the antidotes to that I've found are diversifying your work week, one, and two, getting paid enough. I have colleagues who, they'll talk with me about it, and I'll be like, you could raise your rates. And sometimes when you raise your rates, it just feels more motivating because you're just like, well, I don't know, like it's work, right? And when you are when it's Sunday night and you're thinking about the work week ahead and you feel like you're getting paid pretty well, then it just feels better. I find that therapists are human in that way. All right, let's take a break and we get back more questions. All right, we're back from the break. Let's do an OPP. These people became patrons all the way back in 2020 and have stayed patrons ever since. We have upper tier patron Sunshine from Alabama. We got Jessica from Chicago, David from Cambridge, Mass. Upper tier patron Grace. We have Stephen from Holland. We have Amory from Paris, France. We have Gabby from Chico, California. Upper tier patron Gabby. I've been to Chico. Chaya from Israel. We have Branka from Belgium. We have Shanae from Spokane, Washington, where my family is from. Juliana from Houston, Texas. Alyssa from Encino, California. Upper tier patron Alyssa. We have Sabrina from God knows where. Charlotte from God knows where. We have Megan. I think Megan is from a military base in the Pacific, if I understand what this symbol means. We have Zoe from Dominican Republic. We have Rachel, upper tier patron Rachel from God knows where. Nicole from God knows where. And Amber from Kenmore, Washington. Good old Kenmore. I was just up there. Thank you all for being a patron. Let's go into a question here. Okay, so just getting back to Adam's questions here. And I'll try to be less long-winded because this is going to take forever. But Adam says, what difficult challenges have you faced and overcome during your studies and career? Oh boy, I mean, that's just too big of a question to answer briefly. But I will say that a major challenge was when I had one of my very first supervisors was massively abusive and almost made me quit the career altogether. That was a huge challenge. And I've talked about that before. Number 4 question: what advice would you have benefited from during your studies and early career? What advice would you give your past self? What advice would I give my past self? I think one of the main things I would say is I would tell my past self that just because someone is a therapist and a supervisor doesn't mean that they're a good person, and that you should just be careful. Because I was completely naive. And I remember noticing the fact that I was naive and noticing the fact that I was disabused of that naivete when I had that supervisor. I remember thinking, I guess I just assumed that all therapists were good people, or that all therapists were healthy. And I was quickly disabused of that. And I was like, I guess you can't. And I remember thinking, well, yeah, of course therapists aren't necessarily all healthy people. There's millions of therapists in the world. What's the chance that all of them are 100% healthy? Human beings are therapists, and human beings are on a bell curve of healthy. So, yeah. But other kinds of things that I would tell people in the beginning of their career are things that I actually did, things that I actually followed. Either I knew to follow it, or it just sort of randomly happened that way, which is when you're in graduate school, really lean into learning. Don't fuck around. Don't just go to class to survive. Talk to your professors, call them up, have meetings with them, email them, ask them questions, pick their brain. One, because you're paying a lot of fucking money and you deserve to get a good product for the amount of money you're spending. But also, professors love that shit. That's why they get into this. They want that interaction. They want to know that you care and that you're involved, right? So, sitting back in your chair and just waiting for learning to happen to you is not a good approach. Lean into it. This is the rest of your life, and you get out of it what you put into it, right? So that, and also try to get a mentor, try to get a professor that will shepherd you into your career, because once you graduate, your career can go a lot of different ways. And if you have a good connection and a good mentor, and someone like Paul David, my early mentor, he literally said to me, you don't need to pay for an office, you can use mine. He was just like, in your private practice, you don't need to pay for an office, you can just use my office. And I was like, huh? And he also was like, you don't need to pay for supervision, I'll supervise you for free. And I was like, huh? And then he's like, you just have to become my assistant professor. That's how he sucked me into being a teacher, by the way. I was like, I'm 26 years old. Most of my classmates are in their 30s and 40s. There's no way that I'm going to be a professor. Why would that even enter my brain? I remember thinking maybe in 10 years, I thought, well, maybe I'll think about being a professor in 10 years. But it was very much of it wasn't a thing that I ever thought I would be. But my mentor was like, I want you to be a teacher. And I'm like, what? And this was before I graduated. This was like, he's talking to me the month before I graduate, saying next month I will be a professor with him. And I'm like, what? And then he says, and I'm hesitant. And he's like, well, I'll sweeten the deal by giving you free supervision, and supervision can, in today's dollars, can be, $150 an hour or more. So I'm like, okay. And then he says that he would give me his office for, blah, blah, blah. And I thought, okay. And then he's like, I'll give you clients. And I'm like, okay. So anyway, avail yourself of those things. Another question here. What did you gain from completing a doctorate? What did I gain from completing a doctorate? I don't know what sort of question that is oriented towards, but I gained a lot. I learned a lot. I got the credential. That's pretty much it. Why did you become a professor, and what did you like about teaching? Well, like I said, I became a professor because my mentor coerced me into it. And the other thing is just along these lines, how he tricked me. And thank God he did, by the way. And I've joked around with him about this ever since then. So I'm not talking behind his back about this. But the way that he tricked me was, because I think in his words, he knew that I would be good. And he knew also that I did not think I would be good. So he knew that he had to trick me into it. And so the way he did it is I told him, look, I can't be a professor. I don't know what I'm doing. I'm graduating. Because I wasn't a star student in class. I didn't feel like a star student. Bob was a star student. I wasn't a star student. I was just I was this jock who was in a grunge band and everyone else seemed to know what they were doing. And I certainly didn't. So I'm like, why me? I just, And so so I said, no, I can't teach. And so what he said was, well, you'll correct my papers for me. And I was like, oh, okay, well, I could do that, correcting papers. But in my head, I'm like, I'm not a particularly good writer either. So why would I be correcting papers? But at the very least, that's not in front of a crowd, So we meet our first meeting at the beginning of the term, then the next term after I graduated. And some of the students in the class that I'm supposedly reading their papers in were classmates of mine the previous quarter. So I went from being a classmate, this young classmate, to now being over the students. It was really weird. And then after the first class meeting, we sit down and talk, and he's like, yeah, you're going to teach the next class. And I said, what? And he said, yeah, you're going to do the lecture on Bowen. And I thought, okay. And a big part of the reason why I agreed to it was just because I just felt so beholden to him, because I felt like I owed him, and I did. And I wouldn't have done it otherwise. I would have been like, no, that's not happening. And so I'm really grateful to him for having, pushed me in that way. And what I liked about teaching was all the reasons why I like being a therapist is, helping students, making them feel safe. Like, one of my favorite things was getting a student who had been harmed by previous professors or previous programs. And I would detect that, and I would set out to make them feel secure with me. I wanted to prove to them that I was not going to be like their previous professors, that I was going to believe their stories, and I was going to hear them. I was going to advocate for them. I was going to work with them. And, I'm not going to say everything the student did was perfect. I'm not going to just pass them for no reason, but, I'm not going to give them a passing grade just because I want to prove to them they're still going to have to perform. But emotionally, I wanted to prove it to them that they can trust a professor and that they're a good person. They can trust themselves is the thing. And so that was one thing that I really liked, that kind of intense corrective experience for a student. Also, I felt a great deal of gratification knowing that my students would be going out into the world and helping thousands of people. It's a wonderful feeling to know that I'm helping others to help others. It was just I could go to bed every night just with a big, content grin on my face. Number 7, if I were to complete a minor alongside my psychology major, what minor should it be to help me in my potential career as a therapist? End of email. Well, that implies you're probably getting a bachelor, because usually in your master's degree, you don't have minors. But so I'm guessing that you're getting your bachelor's in psychology and you're wondering what sort of minor you should get. It doesn't really matter, but if you really wanted to go for it, I guess sociology would be the minor, one of the minors, or cultural studies would probably be even better. When people ask me what should I study in my bachelor, I just say, just take whatever you want to. If you plan on being a therapist, it really doesn't matter. Like when at least for me anyway, when I would review applications of people coming into my program, I took note of what they got their bachelor's degree in, but I didn't prefer people that had psychology degrees because I knew that those classes really didn't have anything to do with what therapy. I mean, you could argue it has kind of something to do, and maybe there are bachelor classes that are sort of oriented towards being a therapist, but not usually. All right, this next email is from upper tier patron Lisa from Melbourne, Australia. She says, how do you help clients process partner abuse while remaining in the relationship? Caveat, I'm not talking about family violence or physical abuse, but about subtle yet chronic abuse, such as passive aggression, devaluing, controlling, gaslighting, lack of empathy, and lack of reciprocity. End of email. Yeah, well, it's complicated, but generally speaking, I would use the words by providing support to the client, by validating them, and also getting to the anger. A lot of abuse victims have learned, maybe even in their childhood, to suppress their anger. And I'm not talking about expressing anger through violence or abuse themselves, but anger motivates us to right the wrong. When there's an injustice, when someone abuses us, we feel anger. And the anger motivates us to push back, to get away, to take action. And for people that have been abused long term, they learn that it's best to suppress their anger. And so they have little to no motivation or connection with the self regarding self-preservation or what they deserve in terms of boundaries and care. And so anger is important to connect with, not only to help them unleash in the moment to advocate for themselves, but also a lot of victims will have a lot of pent-up anger, maybe a lifetime of anger that needs to be expressed. And when that anger doesn't have anywhere to go, it can cause depression and all sorts of things. Also, I help victims to become assertive, to speak up for themselves in a way that isn't hostile or abusive themselves, but is appropriately boundaried. And I also will offer to talk with them about systems work, where I will say, would you like to talk about how you might be able to engineer your relationship in a way that improves not only your relationship and you, but also maybe even your partner? You know, like, for example, I might talk with a victim about how they can help their partner who is abusive to be more vulnerable and less abusive. There are ways of encouraging that, priming the pump, so to speak, and then rewarding it so that you can engineer your partner to be less abusive. We can talk about techniques on how to do that. So that's generally what I would do. But of course, every client would be different and every situation would be different. And when I say validation, that sounds all well and good, but you know, sometimes it might take a lot of effort on my part just to help the client to even voice things that I could validate, right? So it's complicated. All right, this next email is from anonymous upper tier patron. She writes, besides food, what are some other ways you have connected with your Japanese heritage throughout your life? End of email. Yeah, that's a great question. There's a lot of things I could say, but I mean, you say besides food, but food. It's a big deal in my family and in our heritage and in our events and our family reunions or family get-togethers, not only Japanese and Japanese American food, and there is a distinction between Japanese and Japanese American. For example, spam musubi isn't exactly a Japanese dish. I wonder if they're starting to serve it in Japan. I don't know. But so food's a big deal. Also, family, just being with my Japanese relatives and Japanese aunts and uncles and grandparents and great aunts and great uncles. And that's a big way to connect with the Japanese culture, Japanese American culture. Also, looking at my ancestry, learning my history, gathering photographs, hearing stories, visiting sites like Manzanar, for example, or other Japanese American places, or traveling to Japan itself. When I went to Japan, it was very interesting. I mean, you know, I'm Japanese American, but I'm fourth generation, so I'm very distant from feeling like I'm Japanese. So in terms of, I feel very Japanese American, but I don't feel very Japanese. And when I went to Japan, I was basically like any other foreigner, just looking around and going, oh my God, where am I? But there are a few moments where I felt at one with, there was this one moment where I was in an onsen, a bathhouse, and it was in the middle of Tokyo, and very elaborate baths. And you know, you go in there naked, and there's different kinds of mineral waters, and there's games you can play like darts, and you wear robes when you play the games. You can have drinks and food, and then they have this outside area, and it was nighttime, like, you know, 1 a.m, and I was in this hot bath, and it was in the middle of summer, so it was pretty warm out anyway, and it was just me and my friend out there, and I got out of the water because I was getting really hot, and I laid down on this stone bench, and I was looking up at the stars, and I felt I had this feeling like my people are from this land. And so it, I connected that way. Another is through Japanese art and cinema. Hayao Miyazaki movies, of course, Akira Kurosawa, other film and other art. I feel a kinship with sculpture and visual art from Japan. I also will buy art. Another thing, actually, I'm looking at it right now. Interestingly, so my dad is Japanese American. My mom is European American. And I have a lot of Japanese things that have been given to me by my family or were passed down to me. And the majority of the Japanese things that are in my house are actually from my white side, because my Japanese side they weren't rich, so they couldn't really afford to buy art and other artifacts, really. But my white side, they were wealthy at a certain point in their life. And my mom's parents would travel to Japan a lot and were really quite fascinated with Japan, and even would work. He was a construction, I don't know what you call it, but a big name in construction in Spokane, Washington, Vern Johnson. And he worked alongside with other Japanese builders, and they built a Japanese garden in Japan in Spokane. And so I'm looking at this, the doll. They have those dolls in those glass cases. And ever since I was a kid, my white grandparents gave me this doll of a horse, like a samurai horse, and I have it in my office. It's been with me through all the different houses that I've lived in, and I always have it on display. And so, little things like that connect me with Japan. Also, holidays and rituals like Obon or Girls' Day, Boys' Day, this kind of stuff. It was big in my family. There's a lot of these kinds of activities when I was growing up. Also, hanging out with the Japanese community in Spokane, which is where my parents are from. My dad and my grandparents were very much in the Japanese American community in Spokane. It's not a big community, but it's there. And whenever we'd go out there for trips and stuff in the summer, we would participate in the Japanese American community. There would be a sukiyaki dinner at the church every year. That was a big deal. So yeah, it's making my mouth water thinking about all the food. But it's interesting because in thinking about your question, the older I get, the less Japanese I feel. I think for a number of reasons. One is when I was young, it was very obvious that I was not a part of society. I wasn't a part of normal society because white people often looked at me very differently, treated me very differently, were racist against me, or would commit microaggressions. Where are you from? And I'd be like, I'm from Issaquah. No. Where are you from? What do you mean? I'm from Issaquah, Washington. What are you talking about? And that doesn't happen anymore. So I'm not otherized a lot. I think a lot of people don't even know I'm Asian American because I don't particularly look that Asian. And also in Seattle, there's a lot of Asians, a lot of half Asians. And so I don't stick out the way I used to. So also, I think that as I get older, there's just less contact with other Japanese American people in particular. When I was young, of course, I had all my siblings and my cousins and my parents. There was a lot of Japanese American culture that we were all embedded in and embodying. But in my life now, I have one Japanese American distant friend, kind of. And so the only time that anything Japanese American ever comes up is when I hang out with my family, which isn't terribly often. But even when I do, the Japanese Americanness of our family is becoming more and more diluted because all of us siblings have for the most part married non-Japanese American people. So the next generation after me and my siblings are all for the most part, well, not all of them, but very little Japanese, very little Asian blood, very little Asian-ness to them. Not always, of course, but like, for example, Alina, who works for the podcast now, they are into a lot of the Japanese anime stuff and know all about that, and go to SakuraCon, which is a con for Japanese anime stuff. So that generation definitely can get into that kind of thing. But the Japanese, when I was a kid in the 70s, I felt like the Japanese Americanness of my life and my family was pretty rich and saturated. But now I feel like, for example, one of the things that we did every meal, I have to emphasize it, every single meal from the day I was born until the day I moved out of the house, we would have dinner at the exact same time. My dad would get home. He would get off work at 5. He'd be home at, I think, 5:20 or something, and we would eat immediately at 5:30. My mom would have dinner ready to go. All 6 of us, mom and dad, me and my 3 siblings, would sit around this circular table, and we would eat. And every single meal was with so if we had spaghetti, for example, it would be on a giant bed of what we called gohan, but what y'all would call, I guess, Japanese sticky rice, like sushi rice style. So the plate, big plate, wall to wall, like edge to edge, inch thick rice. And then on top of that would be spaghetti and meatballs and sauce. Or if we had beef stroganoff, or if we had steak, it would be on a giant bed of rice. So that connection every single day to just that food, from what I understand, the word gohan, which is what the word would be to refer to that sort of rice, from my understanding, the word gohan literally just translates either into rice or just meal, because it's such a staple in early Japanese food, right? Cuisine. And so that also connected me to Japanese, at least Japanese American culture. If you've ever been to a Hawaiian restaurant, which is often basically just a Japanese American thing, they'll have other kinds of things in there too, but a lot of the food in a Hawaiian restaurant, like the loco moco, this kind of stuff, it's very familiar to me. It feels very Japanese American to me. Like the hamburger patty with the gravy over a giant thing of rice is something I ate growing up. And I always hated it too, because I'm like, we're so close to having a hamburger, but we're having Salisbury steak. Whoever came up with this idea, just give me a bun and some ketchup and boom, we got ourselves a hamburger, and then I'll be loving it. But no, have to eat my Salisbury steak. But anyway, I don't do that anymore. I don't eat giant amounts of rice every day. I'll eat it occasionally, but it's pretty rare. And it's a little sacrilegious in my family that I actually don't. So I think I've become more and more whiteized, I guess. Or Asian American culture has become more normalized. Like, for example, growing up in the 70s and even in the 80s, to talk about sushi with white people, they thought of it as disgusting. They just thought, raw fish? What is, oh my God. I mean, they just thought it was the grossest. And I wouldn't even tell people that I had sushi growing up. And then in the, 80s, 90s, suddenly you started having white people going to sushi places, and white people being, and starting to use chopsticks. And it was a very strange thing to me, because I grew up with it all being very disgusting to the, white normative community. And then all of a sudden they're starting to go to sushi places, but it's still kind of rare. But then you fast forward to today, and most people, there's still some people that don't like sushi, of course, but most of the white people I know in Seattle eat sushi on a regular basis. It's considered fine dining to them. For them, it's like, ooh, our special anniversary dinner is to go get some good sushi, and that's a flip. Like, white people have come around. And so you could argue that both I've become whiteized and my town has become more Asianized. So I've just kind of blended in myself to it. Yeah. So I don't know how I feel about that. I don't know if I care, actually. I feel like I should care, but I don't know, like, what is national identity, or what is a cultural identity really, other than just a construction of how I see myself? And I certainly have a pretty good grasp on how I see I really see myself as American, actually. I'm proud to be an American. My version of what an American is, when I see the flag, I see freedom, I see sticking up for the oppressed, I see equality, I see progressiveness, I see sharing and community, I see fighting for the downtrodden, going to war in World War II to stop the genocide of Jewish people in Germany. That's my America. That's not everyone's America, but that's my America. I believe in all those things. Those are wonderful things that are encoded in our Constitution and our national identity. And I don't know. I just consider myself to be an American, a Japanese American, a Seattleite, a liberal American. And Japan and its culture is, it's really distant to me. It's very far off. But I do definitely honor my Japanese American ancestors, right? I think about them. I'm actually working on this project where I'm trying to restore old photos that I've acquired, photos from the 1800s and 20th century that are real grainy or have all these problems. There's websites where you can actually clean up the photographs, and so I'm doing that, and that's pretty interesting to do. And I find that to be a way of honoring my ancestors, not just my Japanese, but my white ancestors as well. Anyway, I'm rambling. It's kind of a rambly episode. I hope that doesn't bother y'all. If it did, I'm guessing you're no longer listening, but let's just end it there. Everyone, or comment below, especially on Patreon. How do you see yourself, especially you Asian Americans? Do you know what I'm talking about? Can you relate? I need some bouncing off with y'all. And everyone out there, please take care of yourself, because you deserve it. You really, really do. You really do.